Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into something really quite interesting. The unexpected connections between autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and Parkinsonism. You actually pointed us towards some great research on this.
Yeah, there's some fascinating work out there. We've looked through clinical studies, genetic findings, and some, really thought-provoking case reports.
Yeah.
And what they seem to suggest is that these two conditions, which most people think of as totally separate neurological issues,
Yeah, very different.
might actually share some surprising underlying links.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's unpack that connection.
Let's do it.
See what the science is saying right now about how ASD and Parkinsonism might be related. We'll pull out the key findings, see where the evidence looks strong.
And also where we need more research, definitely.
Exactly. And as always, we'll try and keep the jargon, to a minimum. Make it clear.
Good plan. So maybe the place to start is, how often do we actually see Parkinsonian signs in people with ASD?
Yeah, good question, because the overall picture from those studies you shared is, well, it's pretty striking, actually. It really does look like Parkinsonism is more common in people with ASD compared to, the general population.
Right.
There was one study that really stood out. It found a much higher frequency of actual Parkinson's disease and also just general Parkinsonian syndromes in adults with ASD.
And the numbers were quite significant, weren't they?
They really were. The odds ratio for younger adults was 32.73. Huge.
Wow.
And even for older adults, the adjusted odds ratio was still 6.1. That's a big difference. It suggests something real is going on there.
It really does. And there were some interesting details within that, too. Like, for older adults with ASD, females actually seem to have higher odds of PD compared to the males.
Oh, that is interesting. A sex difference like that definitely needs more looking into, right? Why would that be?
Exactly. It's one of those findings that raises more questions.
And it wasn't just about getting a formal Parkinson's diagnosis, was it? There was another study looking at just the signs.
Right. That one found that about 32% of adults with autism showed signs of Parkinsonism.
32%. That's nearly a third.
Yeah. And what made that study really compelling was that they accounted for medication use.
Ah, the antipsychotics.
Exactly. Atypical antipsychotics can cause Parkinsonian side effects. So they excluded people taking them or who had taken them.
Right, because you want to rule that out.
And still, 20% showed these features. 20%, even without that potential medication effect.
Okay, so that really points towards it not just being a side effect. It suggests maybe an inherent link.
That's the implication, yeah. And another piece of evidence came from using the Parkinsonism screening questionnaire, the PSQ. They found a noticeable percentage of adults with ASD who didn't have intellectual disability screened positive on that questionnaire, too.
So putting it together, the evidence for adults with ASD having more Parkinsonism seems pretty strong.
It does seem quite compelling for adults, yes.
But what about younger people? Kids, adolescents with ASD, is it the same story there?
It's a bit less clear-cut for younger individuals.
Okay.
The evidence isn't quite as definitive as it is for adults. Some studies hint at it, but it's not as strong.
But not zero evidence.
No, not zero. One study did find that bradykinesia, that's the slowness of movement, a key Parkinsonian sign
Right.
that was more common in both children and adolescents with ASD compared to control groups.
Okay, so maybe not the full cluster of symptoms, but specific motor signs like slowness might be more frequent even earlier on.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
That's something that needs more investigation.
All right, let's pivot slightly then. You mentioned Rett syndrome earlier.
Ah, yes.
That's on the autism spectrum, but it seems to have a particularly strong connection here.
It really does. Rett syndrome shows a very, very pronounced link with Parkinsonian signs.
How pronounced?
Well, studies consistently show high rates of specific features: rigidity, muscle stiffness, hypomimia, that reduced facial expression.
Like the masked face sometimes seen in Parkinson's?
Exactly. Bradykinesia, the slowness we just talked about. And freezing, especially during walking, is very common in Rett.
And the numbers were high, weren't they? I remember seeing things like rigidity up to, 84%?
Yeah, between 43 and 84% depending on the study.
Yeah.
And freezing was noted in over 85% in one report.
That's huge. A massive overlap.
It really is. It's so significant that researchers even developed a specific scale, the Rett Syndrome Rigidity Distribution Score, the RTTRD, just to measure it.
Wow.
And interestingly, that score tends to go up with age in Rett syndrome.
So the rigidity can get worse over time.
It seems so. And maybe linking back to potential mechanisms, that score also correlated with lower levels of homovinilic acid in the cerebrospinal fluid.
Homovanillic acid, that's a dopamine breakdown product, right?
It is. So that hints at a possible dopamine issue in Rett, which is intriguing given dopamine's central role in Parkinson's disease.
Definitely intriguing. You also mentioned something else about Rett, that they often have hyperkinetic disorders alongside the Parkinsonian features. That sounds complicated.
It is a complex picture.
Yeah.
They might have involuntary movements, things like teeth grinding, or those sudden upward eye movements called oculogeric crises,
Okay.
or even dystonia,
Mm.
those sustained muscle contractions causing twisting movements, all happening alongside the slowness and stiffness.
So both too little movement and too much involuntary movement.
Exactly. It really highlights the unique and challenging neurological profile in Rett syndrome.
Okay. So we're seeing this clinical overlap, especially in adults with ASD, and dramatically in Rett syndrome. Let's get into the why. Is there evidence for shared genetics?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Several genetic studies have pointed towards potential overlap. They found genes known to be linked to Parkinson's that also seem to pop up in ASD research.
Okay, let's dig into those. You mentioned PARA-K2 seemed pretty important.
Yes, PARA-K2 is a big one. Multiple studies, and this is key, across different populations.
Right, not just one group.
No, Portuguese, Han Chinese, people of European ancestry, they've all found that variations in the PRK2 gene, specifically copy number variations or CNVs.
So having too many or too few copies of the gene.
Exactly. Those CNVs, including deletions of the whole gene or bits of it, seem to be more common in people with ASD compared to controls.
And PARK2 is a known Parkinson's gene.
It's one of the most well-established genes linked to early-onset Parkinson's. So finding these variations more often in ASD is a pretty significant clue.
Yeah, that sounds like strong evidence for a shared genetic risk factor. What about RIT2? That was another one.
RIT2, yeah. One study looked at SNPs. Those are like single-letter changes in the genetic code.
Tiny variations.
Tiny variations. And they found specific SNPs in RIT2 might increase susceptibility to both Parkinson's and ASD.
Both conditions again.
Yes. They saw significant frequency differences for one particular SNP, RS12456492, in both PD and ASD groups compared to controls, though the ASD link was, maybe approaching statistical significance. So possibly a shared vulnerability factor there, too.
Okay, another potential link. And then CD157BST1.
Right. Similar story. This is another gene linked to Parkinson's risk.
Mm-hmm.
And variations, specific SNPs in this gene, have also been associated with ASD. Studies found some SNPs were significantly more common in people with ASD than in controls.
It's really fascinating how these genes, first understood through Parkinson's research, are now showing up as relevant for ASD too.
It really is. It suggests these pathways might be important for more than just one condition.
You mentioned a few others where the evidence was maybe less solid.
Yeah, there are others like DRD2, GPCR37, some from the SLC gene family, SLC9A9, and SLC6A3 showed up in individual cases with both conditions. And SMPD1, there's another one linked recently to PD, and a mutation was found in someone with autism and epilepsy. But for these, the evidence linking them definitively to both ASD and Parkinsonism is still more preliminary. We need more research to really confirm their roles across both conditions.
So PRK2, RIT2, CD157BST1 seem like the stronger candidates for shared genetic links right now, but others are sort of ones to watch.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Now, besides these kinds of susceptibility genes, did the case reports show instances where really rare specific mutations caused both ASD and Parkinsonism together in one person?
Yes, absolutely. Those case reports were quite revealing. For instance, there were 2 cases of Rett syndrome where they had the known MECP2 gene mutation.
Right, the cause of Rett.
And these individuals clearly showed both autistic behaviors and Parkinsonian signs like bradykinesia and rigidity.
Okay.
What was particularly interesting was that they didn't respond to levodopa treatment.
Levodopa, the standard Parkinson's drug. They didn't respond.
Nope. Which might suggest that the Parkinsonism in these Rett cases, even though it looks similar, might stem from a different underlying biological issue than typical Parkinson's.
That's a really important point. Similar symptoms don't always mean the exact same cause. What about other rare mutations?
We also saw cases involving mutations in genes like ATP13A2, CLN3, and WDR45. Again, these individuals had both autistic features and Parkinsonism.
And did they respond to levodopa?
It was variable. Some did, some didn't, which again just highlights the complexity. When you see this overlap, the underlying reasons might differ from case to case.
So this combination of clinical observations, the genetic links, the rare mutation cases, it really builds a compelling picture of some kind of connection. What about shared mechanisms? What might actually be going wrong biologically in both conditions?
Well, one of the leading candidates, as we hinted at earlier, involves the dopamine system.
Dopamine.
Right.
Crucial for movement in Parkinson's.
Absolutely. But it's also deeply involved in things like social behavior, motivation, reward processing, areas often affected in ASD.
Okay, so a disruption in dopamine could theoretically impact both sets of functions.
That's the thinking, and there's some evidence to back it up.
What kind of evidence points to dopamine issues in ASD?
Well, some studies have found reduced levels of what's called presynaptic dopamine. It's dopamine before it gets released in the prefrontal cortex of kids with ASD.
Okay.
And other research has shown that in individuals with ASD, there might be less dopamine released in the striatum, a key brain area for movement and reward, specifically in response to social situations or stimuli.
Ah, so the dopamine system might not be responding typically, especially to social cues in ASD?
That seems to be part of the picture, yes.
And didn't you mention animal models too?
Yes, mouse models developed to study ASD have shown changes in dopamine levels in certain brain areas. And interestingly, these mice often show behaviors that look a bit like the repetitive motor movements or stereotypies often seen in ASD.
So the animal studies also seem to support this idea of altered dopamine signaling being relevant.
They do provide another line of evidence suggesting that dopamine dysregulation could be a shared factor contributing to symptoms in both conditions.
Okay, so we've got clinical links, genetic clues, potential dopamine involvement. But you also flagged that actually studying Parkinsonism in people with ASD is tricky.
It really is. There are some significant challenges.
Like what?
Well, a big one we touched on is medication. Many individuals with ASD take atypical antipsychotics for behavioral symptoms.
Right.
And those drugs are known to sometimes cause Parkinsonian side effects. So, disentangling drug-induced symptoms from underlying Parkinsonism can be really difficult.
Trying to figure out what's causing what.
Exactly. Studies try to control for it, like the one we mentioned earlier, but it's always a confounding factor to consider carefully.
Makes sense. What else makes it challenging?
Another thing is the potential overlap in symptoms themselves. Some motor signs of Parkinsonism, like maybe repetitive movements or an unusual gait,
Yeah.
could look similar to motor stereotypies or other motor patterns that are already considered part of ASD itself.
Ah, so telling apart an ASD feature from an early Parkinsonian sign could be hard.
It can be, especially without specialist assessment. And that leads to another point. People with ASD might not routinely see movement disorder specialists unless their motor issues become really prominent. So Parkinsonism could simply be missed or underrecognized.
I see. And I guess communication differences in ASD could add another layer of difficulty.
Absolutely. Getting a detailed history of symptoms, understanding how things have changed over time, that's crucial for diagnosing Parkinsonism. And that can be much harder if the individual has limited verbal communication or finds it difficult to describe their internal experiences.
So even with the growing evidence for a link, actually identifying and studying Parkinsonism in people with ASD faces some real practical hurdles.
It does. It really underscores the need for careful, expert evaluation, maybe even collaboration between ASD specialists and movement disorder specialists.
Yeah, bringing those fields together.
And being aware of these complexities when interpreting symptoms.
Okay. Well, this has been incredibly informative, really digging into a connection I hadn't fully appreciated before. To kind of wrap things up, what are the main takeaways we should leave with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this link between ASD and Parkinsonism seems more real and significant than maybe previously thought.
Right.
We see it clinically, especially in adults, and very clearly in conditions like Rett. We see it genetically, with genes like PRK2 popping up in both. And there's this plausible shared mechanism involving dopamine dysregulation.
But with the caveat that there's still a lot to figure out.
Oh, absolutely. Loads more research is needed.
What kind of research specifically? Where should the focus be?
We definitely need more prospective, long-term studies following people with ASD over many years to see how or if Parkinsonian signs develop and progress.
See how it unfolds over time.
Exactly. We need larger, more detailed genetic studies to really pin down the shared genetic architecture, and crucially, more basic science research using cell models, animal models, maybe brain imaging to understand the shared biological pathways. That's where we might find clues for potential treatments or biomarkers down the line.
So lots of work still to do in this really dynamic area. All right, as we finish up, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, these emerging connections between ASD and Parkinsonism, what might this mean for the future? How should we think about early identification or monitoring people with ASD as they age? Does this change anything?
It's a big question.
Yeah. Is there maybe a need for greater awareness of motor symptoms, potential Parkinsonian signs within the ASD community itself, among families, doctors, therapists? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.